In 1891, a fire swept through a mansion in Ascension Parish, Louisiana. As the flames consumed the third floor, something unusual happened. The heat caused the floor to collapse, revealing a staircase that descended into darkness. When firefighters explored what they thought would be a simple root cellar, they found themselves in a network of underground rooms that stretched beneath the entire property. The architecture was precise: brick archways, ventilation shafts. And in one locked chamber, they discovered something that made even hardened men step back in horror. 17 iron examination tables, leather restraints worn thin from decades of use, and walls covered in meticulous handwriting, names, dates, physical descriptions, medical notations written in clinical French that documented procedures no human being should ever endure. The fire marshal's report described it as a medical facility of unknown purpose, but the elderly black residents of the parish knew exactly what it was. They had heard the stories their mothers and grandmothers whispered, stories about the rooms beneath Riverside Plantation, stories about what Madame Josephine Blanchard forced young women to endure in the name of profit and science. What makes this discovery particularly disturbing is not just what happened in those rooms, but how common it was. Between 1820 and 1865, at least 40 plantations across Louisiana operated similar facilities. Underground chambers specifically designed for one purpose: turning enslaved women's bodies into factories for producing human commodities. This wasn't the random brutality of individual slaveholders. This was systematic, documented, refined over decades into a business model that Louisiana's wealthiest families discussed openly at dinner parties and agricultural meetings. Before we descend into those basement rooms and confront what happened there, I need you to understand something. This story isn't about distant history. The last woman who was born in one of these breeding chambers died in 1971. Her name was Sarah Mouton. She was 93 years old and lived in Baton Rouge. She spent her entire life trying to find her mother, a woman she had seen only twice before being sold away at age 8. If you're watching from Louisiana or anywhere in the South, drop a comment with your city. Your connection to this history matters. These weren't just victims. They were grandmothers, great-great-grandmothers whose bloodlines run through millions of Americans living today. And subscribe to The Sealed Room, because stories like this don't just need to be told, they need to be preserved, remembered, understood in all their terrible complexity. Because what happened in those basement rooms reveals something that history textbooks prefer to skip over. They teach you about cotton economics, about political debates over slavery's expansion, but they don't teach you about the women who were locked underground and medically monitored to ensure their bodies produced maximum profit. Let me take you back to 1834, Ascension Parish, Louisiana, 50 miles upriver from New Orleans along the Mississippi. The land here was some of the richest in North America, alluvial soil that produced sugarcane so thick and tall it looked like a green ocean stretching to the horizon. The plantations along this stretch of river were kingdoms unto themselves, thousands of acres, hundreds of enslaved people, wealth that would make modern billionaires seem modest by comparison. Riverside Plantation was established in 1803 by Josephine Blanchard, a French Creole who had fled Saint-Domingue during the Haitian Revolution. He built a mansion that became legendary: 3 stories of imported marble and mahogany, galleries that wrapped around the entire structure, gardens that featured plants shipped from Europe and the Caribbean. The whole thing sat on a slight rise overlooking the river, a monument to power and control. But it was Etienne's daughter, Josephine, who would turn Riverside into something far more disturbing than a symbol of wealth. Josephine Blanchard was not what you'd expect from a woman in Antebellum, Louisiana. She never married. She ran the plantation herself after her father's death in 1828, making her one of the few women in Louisiana who controlled property worth over $1 million. She corresponded with physicians in Paris and Edinburgh. She subscribed to medical journals. She attended lectures at the Medical College of Louisiana, sitting in the back row where women were grudgingly permitted. Her neighbors considered her eccentric but brilliant. Her enslaved population considered her the devil in silk dresses. Here's what made Josephine different from other plantation owners. Most slaveholders in the 1,832 were still buying their enslaved workforce from the domestic slave trade. Virginia and Maryland were essentially breeding grounds, supplying the Deep South with a constant stream of human beings torn from their families and sold downriver. Josephine looked at this system and saw inefficiency. Why pay premium prices for enslaved people from Virginia when you could produce your own? Why rely on traders when you could create a self-sustaining workforce that grew more valuable with each generation? She began her experiments in 1829. That's when the construction started. Local builders thought they were installing expanded wine cellars beneath the main house. The project took 14 months and employed 30 skilled masons and carpenters. The result was a network of underground chambers that stretched nearly 200 feet beneath the property. Temperature-controlled, ventilated through cleverly disguised shafts, and completely invisible from above ground. You could walk across the manicured lawns of Riverside Plantation and have no idea that directly beneath your feet were rooms where young women were being systematically transformed into breeding stock. The first woman brought to those rooms was named Charlotte. She was 16 years old, born on the plantation, healthy, literate, because Josephine believed intelligence was an inheritable trait that would increase future children's value. Charlotte had grown up thinking she might work in the house, might have a relatively safe position in the hierarchy of plantation life. Instead, on a spring morning in 1830, she was summoned to the main house. Josephine herself met her, not unkindly. That was the thing about Josephine. She wasn't screaming or violent. She was calm, clinical. She explained to Charlotte that she had been selected for an important role, that she would receive better food, better clothing, better quarters than field workers, that her children would be trained for skilled positions, would never know the brutality of the cane fields. All Charlotte had to do was cooperate with certain procedures. Then Josephine led her down a staircase hidden behind a panel in the main house library, down into a corridor lit by oil lamps, down into rooms that smelled of disinfectant and something else Charlotte couldn't identify, fear maybe, or despair so thick it had soaked into the brick walls. The first room Charlotte entered was approximately 20 feet square. The ceiling was low, supported by brick arches that gave it the feeling of a crypt. Along one wall stood glass-fronted cabinets holding medical instruments, speculums, forceps, devices Charlotte had never seen before and couldn't name. In the center of the room sat a table unlike anything she'd encountered, padded leather surface, stirrups at one end, leather straps at precise intervals. And standing beside that table was Dr. Armand Devereaux, 56 years old, graduate of the Medical College of Louisiana. A man who had spent 30 years as a physician to New Orleans' wealthiest families. A man who was about to examine Charlotte's body with the same detached professionalism he might apply to inspecting a horse. What happened over the next 2 hours destroyed something fundamental in Charlotte, not just her bodily autonomy, though that was certainly violated, but her understanding of what human beings were capable of doing to each other while maintaining perfect civility. Dr. Devereaux spoke throughout the examination, explaining procedures to Josephine, noting observations in a leather-bound journal, commenting on Charlotte's physical characteristics as if she weren't a person lying terrified on that table, but a specimen to be catalogued. Excellent pelvic structure, he noted. Bone density suggests strong constitution, no obvious defects. I would estimate reproductive capacity at 8 to 10 live births, assuming standard intervals and adequate nutritional support. Josephine stood nearby, watching, making her own notes, asking questions about optimal timing for conception, dietary requirements during pregnancy, methods for increasing the likelihood of multiple births. They discussed Charlotte's future as if she were a crop they were planning, as if her body was simply a resource to be managed for maximum yield. When it was over, Charlotte was led to another room. This one was smaller, 8 feet by 10 feet, a narrow bed, a chamber pot, a small table with a Bible on it. This would be her home for the foreseeable future. The door closed. The lock clicked. And Charlotte understood that her life, as she had known it, was over. She was the first, but she wouldn't be the last. Over the next 3 years, Josephine expanded her program systematically. She selected 12 young women from Riverside's enslaved population, all between ages 15 and 22, all healthy, all possessing characteristics Josephine believed would produce valuable children. Intelligence, physical strength, specific physical appearances that would command premium prices in urban slave markets. The underground complex grew to accommodate them. Individual cells, a common room where the women did needlework under supervision, a kitchen that prepared specialized diets rich in protein and calcium, a nursery for infants, and at the center of it all, the medical chambers where Dr. Devereaux conducted his examinations and procedures. But Josephine's innovation went beyond simply forcing women to bear children. Other plantation owners did that. What made Riverside's program unique was the systematic documentation and the deliberate genetic management. Josephine kept journals that read like agricultural breeding records. She tracked bloodlines across generations. She documented which pairings, as she called them, produced children with desired traits. She experimented with different combinations, trying to breed enslaved people the way others might breed horses or cattle. She maintained meticulous records of every woman's menstrual cycles. Dr. Devereaux examined the women weekly, timing their assignments to what he believed were optimal fertility windows. The men selected for these assignments were chosen based on Josephine's breeding charts. Height, strength, complexion, skills, even temperament was considered inheritable. The men had no more choice than the women. Refuse, and you'd be sold to the sugar mills downriver, where life expectancy for field workers was measured in years. Cooperate, and you'd receive better rations, lighter work assignments. You'd be complicit in the system that was destroying other people's humanity, but you'd survive. And that was the genius of Josephine's system. She didn't need overseers with whips. She built a structure where survival required cooperation, where the threat of something worse made people participate in their own oppression. Let me tell you about Rachel. She was brought to the basement rooms in 1832, 17 years old. She had been purchased at auction in New Orleans specifically for Josephine's program. The bill of sale described her as healthy, intelligent, suitable for domestic service or breeding. That last word, breeding, written right there in legal documents, as if Rachel were livestock. Rachel's introduction to the program followed the same pattern Charlotte had experienced. The examination, the clinical discussion of her body's reproductive potential, the small cell that would become her prison. But Rachel had something Charlotte hadn't possessed: rage. During her first week underground, Rachel refused to eat. She screamed at Dr. Devereaux during examinations. She tore at the leather restraints until her wrists bled. She made it clear that she would rather die than cooperate with what Josephine had planned. Josephine's response revealed the calculated cruelty beneath her civilized exterior. She didn't beat Rachel. She didn't starve her. Instead, she brought another woman to Rachel's cell. A woman named Mary, who was 8 months pregnant, who had been part of the program since its beginning. And Josephine explained, very calmly, that Rachel's cooperation would determine Mary's fate. Continued resistance would mean Mary would be sold immediately after giving birth. Sold to a particularly brutal plantation owner Josephine knew in Point Coupe Parish. Mary's baby would be sold separately. Mary would die in the cane fields within a year, and her child would grow up never knowing a mother's love. But if Rachel cooperated, Mary would remain at Riverside. She'd be allowed to nurse her baby, to see that child grow up. It was a choice that wasn't a choice, and Rachel understood that Josephine would make good on the threat, so she stopped screaming, stopped refusing food, stopped resisting. She learned what all the women in the program learned, that survival required a kind of psychological splitting. You separated your mind from your body. You went somewhere else during the examinations, during the forced encounters, during the pregnancies you couldn't prevent. You built walls inside your head to protect whatever small piece of yourself you could keep sacred. The women developed their own language down there in the basement, coded phrases that let them communicate under the supervision of the house servants Josephine assigned to monitor them. They shared strategies for emotional survival. They told stories to each other about lives they'd lived before, dreams they still held despite everything. They became a community forged in shared trauma. Mothers who would never raise their children. Women whose bodies had become battlegrounds in an economic war they hadn't chosen. And above them, on the surface, Riverside Plantation continued its facade of genteel southern civilization. Josephine hosted dinners, attended church, made charitable donations to the Catholic orphanage in Donaldsonville. She was respected, admired even, a woman who had taken control of her inheritance and managed it with remarkable efficiency. No one talked about the rooms beneath her house, or if they knew, they didn't care, because in 1834 Louisiana, what Josephine was doing was perfectly legal. Enslaved people were property, and what you did with your property was your business. By 1836, Riverside Plantation's underground facility housed 23 women. The oldest was 34. The youngest had just turned 15. Together, they had produced 41 children in 6 years. Of those 41, 17 had been sold by age 10. 12 remained at Riverside, being trained for various skilled positions. The others had died in infancy or early childhood, their tiny bodies buried in an unmarked section of the plantation cemetery. Josephine documented every birth, every death, every sale with the precision of a ledger clerk. Her journals, discovered after the 1891 fire, reveal a mind that had completely divorced morality from methodology. She wrote about enslaved women's pregnancies, the way a modern factory might document production yields. She noted output efficiency. She calculated return on investment. She compared the profitability of her breeding program to cotton and sugar cultivation and concluded with evident satisfaction that human reproduction outperformed agricultural products by a significant margin. One entry from March 1836 is particularly chilling. Charlotte delivered her 4th child today, male. Excellent proportions. Light complexion will command premium price in New Orleans market by age 12. Total production from Charlotte. 4 live births, 3 surviving to age 5. Projected combined value of $3,400. Initial acquisition cost, $0. Plantation born. Current age, 22. Estimated remaining productive years, 8 to 10. Projected lifetime value, $7,000 to $8,500. This represents superior return compared to cotton production from equivalent land acreage. Charlotte, the first woman brought to those rooms, had become a line item in a profit calculation. Her body was now measured in dollars and projected yields. Her children were inventory. But what Josephine's clinical journals couldn't capture was what was happening in the minds of the women trapped in her system. The psychological warfare they waged just to maintain their sanity. The small acts of resistance that never made it into official records. Let me tell you about what they called the forgetting ritual. The women created it together, in whispered conversations during the brief periods when supervision lapsed. When a child was sold away, the mother would gather with the other women in the common room. They would sit in a circle, and they would tell stories about the child, every detail they could remember, the sound of the baby's first cry, the way the child smiled, favorite foods, small jokes, personality quirks. They would tell these stories over and over for 3 days, memorizing every detail, burning it into their minds. And then, on the 4th day, they would perform the forgetting ritual. The mother would stand in the center of the circle, and she would speak directly to her absent child. She would say everything she needed to say, how much she loved them, how she wished she could have protected them, how she hoped they would survive whatever lay ahead. She would pour out her heart completely, holding nothing back, and then the other women would help her lock it away. They would remind her that to survive, she needed to separate the love from the daily reality. That she could keep her child in a sacred place in her mind, but she couldn't let grief destroy her ability to function. Because if she broke down completely, Josephine would consider her unproductive. And unproductive women were sold to the worst plantations in Louisiana. It was brutal pragmatism born of absolute powerlessness. They saved each other by teaching each other how to survive emotional devastation that should have been unsurvivable. Rachel, who had initially resisted so fiercely, became one of the strongest practitioners of this survival technique. By 1838, she had given birth to 3 children. 2 had been sold. The third, a daughter named Grace, remained in Riverside's nursery. Rachel learned to work within the system while secretly maintaining her defiance. She cooperated during examinations. She followed the dietary regimens Dr. Devereaux prescribed. She participated in the pairings Josephine orchestrated, but inside, she never stopped fighting. She began to memorize the breeding records. During the hours she spent doing needlework in the common room, she would observe when Josephine brought down the journals to update them. She'd catch glimpses of the pages, names, dates, sales prices. She committed everything she could to memory, building a mental archive of what was happening in those underground rooms. Rachel didn't have a plan for what she'd do with this information. There was no legal recourse, no authority that would intervene on behalf of enslaved women. But some instinct told her that documentation mattered, that if these crimes were ever to be acknowledged, someone needed to preserve the truth. The other women noticed Rachel's careful attention to the records, and slowly they began contributing their own pieces to the puzzle. One woman would remember the name of a child sold to a particular buyer. Another would recall the date of a specific birth. Together, they created a collective memory that paralleled Josephine's official documentation. They called it the true accounting, and it would become crucial evidence decades later. But in 1838, survival was measured in days, not decades. In small victories, not grand resistance. In maintaining enough humanity to love your children even when you knew you'd lose them. In finding ways to be kind to each other in a place designed to strip away every human connection. Dr. Devereaux visited the underground complex every Tuesday and Friday. His examinations were thorough and humiliating. He treated the women's bodies as machines to be maintained and optimized. When pregnancies occurred, he monitored them with obsessive attention, weight gain, fetal positioning, any sign of complications. His interest wasn't humanitarian. Josephine paid him a bonus for every healthy birth, and she penalized him financially when women died in childbirth or when babies were stillborn. This created a perverse incentive structure where Dr. Devereaux actually provided better medical care than enslaved women typically received on plantations, not because he cared about their well-being, but because their survival affected his income. The delivery room where he attended births was remarkably advanced for the 1,830 seconds, clean linens, sterilized instruments, chloroform for pain management during difficult deliveries. He employed techniques he'd learned from European medical journals. He tracked maternal mortality rates and infant survival statistics with the same attention other doctors might give to epidemic disease patterns. Riverside's maternal mortality rate was actually lower than the Louisiana state average. Josephine noted this statistic with pride in letters to other plantation owners who were considering implementing similar programs. "The key," she wrote to a planter in Natchitoches Parish, "is maintaining the assets in good condition. A dead mother represents significant capital loss. Dr. Devereaux understands that his primary responsibility is preserving my investment. The emotional states of the women are irrelevant, but their physical health directly impacts profitability." This was the calculation that allowed Josephine to provide relatively good medical care while denying every human right. The women weren't people deserving of health, they were investments, requiring maintenance. In 1839, Josephine expanded her program again. She purchased 8 young women at the New Orleans slave market, specifically selecting for characteristics she believed would produce high-value children. Intelligence, physical beauty by the aesthetic standards of the time, light skin that would command premium prices in urban markets where enslaved people worked as domestic servants or skilled artisans. One of these women was named Pauline. She was 18 years old. She had been raised in a relatively privileged position as a house servant in a New Orleans merchant's home. She could read and write in French and English. She could play piano. She had been taught to present herself with the refined manners that wealthy white families demanded from their enslaved domestic workers. When the merchant died and his estate was liquidated, Pauline found herself on an auction block. Josephine paid $1,200 for her, an enormous sum that reflected Pauline's skills and appearance. Pauline's introduction to Riverside's underground rooms shattered the remnants of the relatively sheltered life she'd known. She had experienced the cruelty and injustice of slavery in New Orleans. She understood that she was property, that she had no legal rights, that her life could be upended at any moment. But nothing had prepared her for the systematic, medicalized exploitation that awaited her beneath Josephine's mansion. The first time Dr. Devereaux examined her, Pauline tried to maintain her dignity by retreating into the formal manners she'd been taught. She answered his questions politely. She tried to endure the examination with the same composed facade she'd used when serving at her former master's dinner parties. But there was no maintaining dignity in that examination room. Dr. Devereaux's procedures were designed to be degrading, the positions he required, the instruments he used, the clinical commentary he provided to Josephine while Pauline lay restrained on that leather table. When it was over, Pauline was led to her cell, and for the first time in her life, she understood that there were forms of violation that couldn't be endured with good manners and composed silence. She sat on the narrow bed in that windowless room and felt something fundamental break inside her. Rachel found her there several hours later. By 1839, Rachel had achieved a strange status in the underground community. She'd survived the program longer than most. She'd learned to navigate Josephine's system. She'd become someone the newer women looked to for guidance on how to endure. Rachel sat beside Pauline on that narrow bed. She didn't offer false comfort. She didn't pretend things would get better. Instead, she told Pauline the truth. This is going to destroy parts of you that you didn't know could be destroyed. You're going to lose pieces of yourself that you thought were permanent. Your body is going to be used in ways that will make you want to die. And you might want to die. Most of us do, at some point. Pauline looked at her, tears streaming down her face. Then why are you telling me this? Why not just let me have whatever hope I can hold on to? Rachel's voice was steady. Because false hope is worse than no hope. False hope means you think if you just endure this examination, or this pregnancy, or this separation from a child, things will improve. But they won't. This is your life now. So, you need to learn how to survive it without hope. How do you survive without hope? You survive for the small things, for the moments when you make another woman laugh, for the feeling of a baby moving inside you before you have to give them up, for the satisfaction of memorizing one more detail that Josephine would prefer to keep hidden. You survive not because you believe things will get better, but because surviving becomes its own purpose. Because every day you stay alive is a day you haven't let them completely destroy you. This conversation, recreated from testimony Pauline gave 60 years later, reveals the psychological strategies these women developed. They didn't delude themselves with optimism. They faced their reality with brutal honesty. And they survived by finding meaning in resistance so small it was almost invisible. The underground community developed its own culture. They sang songs quietly during the hours when supervision was lax. Spirituals mostly, with lyrics that took on new meaning in their circumstances. Songs about deliverance that once meant salvation in the next life, now meant freedom in this one. Songs about rivers that once symbolized religious baptism, now meant the Mississippi River and escape north. They told stories. Some were memories of lives before Riverside, carefully preserved and shared so that each woman could hold on to the knowledge that she had once been more than this. Others were fantasies about the future, about children who might somehow find each other years after being sold apart, about justice that might someday come, even if they didn't live to see it. And they practiced small rebellions that Josephine never detected. They deliberately misheard instructions. They worked slowly when they could get away with it. They accidentally ruined expensive fabric during sewing projects. These acts didn't change their fundamental circumstances, but they provided psychological victories that sustained them. Josephine's breeding program expanded steadily through the early 1842s. By 1843, the underground complex housed 31 women. The nursery held 19 children under age 6. Another 23 children born in the program were now old enough to work, distributed throughout Riverside's operations, or sold to other plantations. The financial returns were exactly what Josephine had calculated. Between 1,830 and 1,843, the breeding program had generated over $89,000 in documented revenue from sales of children, plus the increased value of Riverside's self-sustaining labor force. For comparison, Riverside's sugar operations generated approximately $45,000 annually during the same period. Josephine's success attracted attention. Other plantation owners began visiting Riverside to study her methods. She gave tours of the underground facility to select peers, explaining her breeding theories and sharing her documentation techniques. She discussed optimal pairing strategies over dinner in her elegant mansion, while directly beneath the dining room, women sat in their cells preparing for forced pregnancies. At least 6 other plantations in Louisiana implemented similar programs based on Josephine's model. The practice spread to Mississippi and Alabama. A network of slaveholders who saw human reproduction as their most profitable enterprise began corresponding with each other, sharing data and refining techniques. They discussed it all in terms of agricultural improvement and scientific management. They used language that sanitized what they were actually doing. They called it population enhancement and bloodline management and natural increase optimization. But what they were doing was systematically raping women and selling their children. No amount of clinical terminology could disguise that fundamental truth. In 1844, something happened that revealed the limits of even Josephine's carefully constructed system. A woman named Marie, who had been part of the breeding program since 1837, became pregnant for the 6th time. The pregnancy proceeded normally through 7 months. Dr. Devereaux's regular examinations detected no complications. Then Marie went into premature labor. The delivery was difficult. After 19 hours, Marie gave birth to a stillborn infant. She began hemorrhaging. Dr. Devereaux worked desperately to stop the bleeding, employing every technique he knew. But sometimes, even with medical intervention, the human body fails. Marie died on that delivery table 48 hours after labor began. She was 27 years old. Her death represented a significant financial loss for Josephine. Marie had produced 5 children who survived to be sold, generating over $4,000 in revenue. She had potentially 8 to 10 more productive years. Josephine calculated the loss at approximately $6,000 in unrealized future value. But for the women in the underground community, Marie's death meant something entirely different. She was one of them. Someone who had endured the same violations, shared the same small rebellions, participated in the same rituals of survival. Her death reminded them that their bodies could only endure so much. That pregnancy and childbirth, even with medical attention, carried risks that multiplied with each successive birth. Rachel organized the morning ritual. The women gathered in the common room. They told stories about Marie. They remembered her laugh, the way she sang lullabies to babies in the nursery, her skill at embroidery, the time she had deliberately sewn an obscene phrase in French into the hem of a dress Josephine wore to church. a rebellion so small and hidden that only the women who knew ever appreciated it. They mourned her, not just as a friend, but as a casualty of a war they were fighting against impossible odds. And they added her name to the true accounting, the collective memory they maintained in defiance of Josephine's official records. Josephine's response to Marie's death was entirely practical. She purchased a replacement at the next New Orleans slave auction. A woman named Sophie, 19 years old, healthy, ready to be incorporated into the breeding program. The system continued without pause. Because individual deaths didn't matter to Josephine. She was managing populations, not people. One woman could be replaced with another. The machinery of human reproduction she had built just kept operating. But something shifted in the underground community after Marie's death. The women began to talk more openly about resistance, not dramatic escape attempts that would certainly fail. Not violent rebellion that would result in their deaths, but systematic resistance, documentation, preservation of truth. Rachel's project of memorizing the breeding records became more organized. Multiple women participated, each responsible for remembering different aspects. Names of children sold, buyers who purchased them, dates, prices, physical descriptions that might help someone trace bloodlines decades later. They didn't know why they were doing this. They had no realistic hope that this information would ever be used to reunite families or bring justice. But the act of documenting, of refusing to let their experiences disappear into Josephine's sanitized ledgers, became its own form of resistance. In 1846, a priest named Father Gabriel Rousseau began visiting Riverside Plantation quarterly to provide religious instruction. He was a young man, recently ordained, genuinely devoted to his faith and deeply troubled by slavery's moral implications. When Josephine showed him the underground complex, explaining that these women needed spiritual guidance as they fulfilled their duties to the plantation, Father Rousseau was horrified. He recognized immediately that what he was seeing was systematic sexual exploitation disguised as agricultural management. He confronted Josephine directly. "Madame Blanchard, what you are doing here violates every principle of human dignity and Christian morality. These women are not livestock. They are human souls created in God's image." Josephine's response was calm and devastating in its logic. "Father, I respect your spiritual authority, but surely you understand that the Church has not condemned slavery itself. These are my property under Louisiana law. I am managing my property responsibly, providing excellent medical care and ensuring these women and their children are well fed and healthy. What would you have me do? Release them to poverty and starvation, abandon my responsibilities as a property owner?" Father Rousseau tried to argue theology and morality. Josephine countered with law and economics. The conversation ended in stalemate. The priest continued his quarterly visits, providing what spiritual comfort he could to the women, but taking no action that would actually disrupt Josephine's operations. This accommodation, this willingness to witness atrocity without intervening meaningfully, would haunt Father Rousseau for the rest of his life. In 1878, as an elderly man, he gave testimony about what he'd seen at Riverside. He described his own moral failure with painful honesty. "I told myself I was helping by bringing them the sacraments," he said. "But the truth is, I was too cowardly to do what Christian morality demanded. I should have exposed what was happening. I should have used whatever influence I had to stop it. Instead, I gave Madame Blanchard the veneer of religious approval by continuing to visit. I baptized children who would be sold away from their mothers. I heard confessions from women who had nothing to confess except the crime of surviving, and I did nothing to actually challenge the system. I will answer for that cowardice when I face God's judgment." But in 1846, Father Rousseau simply continued his visits. He became another fixture in the underground rooms. The women appreciated his kindness, but they understood that kindness without action was just another form of complicity. By 1850, Riverside Plantation's breeding program had been operating for 21 years. The underground complex had produced 127 children. 73 of them had been sold, generating documented revenue of $67,400. The remaining children worked throughout Riverside's operations or were still too young for productive labor. But something was changing in the world above ground. Political tensions over slavery's expansion were intensifying. California's admission as a free state had shifted the balance of power in Congress. The Fugitive Slave Act had inflamed northern opposition to slavery. And in Louisiana itself, enslaved people were beginning to hear whispers of a growing movement that questioned whether human beings should be property at all. These national debates barely touched Riverside's underground rooms. The women trapped there had no access to newspapers or political discussions, but they sensed something shifting. Father Rousseau, during his visits, would sometimes mention tensions in Washington or conflicts between North and South. The house servants who brought food down to the complex would whisper fragments of conversations they'd overheard. Hope is a dangerous thing for people in impossible situations. It can sustain you, or it can destroy you when it proves false. The women in Riverside's basement learned to hold hope carefully, like a candle flame you protect from the wind, but don't dare hold too close. Pauline, who had arrived in 1839, had by 1850 given birth to 4 children. 3 had been sold. 1, a son named Marcus, remained at Riverside. He was 9 years old, already being trained as a carpenter. Pauline saw him perhaps once a month during Father Rousseau's visits, when the children were brought down for religious instruction. Marcus didn't call her mother. He'd been taught to call her Pauline, to understand that his real family was Riverside Plantation, that his loyalty belonged to Madame Blanchard. But during those brief visits, Pauline would find ways to touch his hand, to speak to him in the coded language the women had developed. She would tell him stories that seemed like simple fairy tales, but actually contained information about his heritage. She'd describe a princess who lived in a hidden kingdom beneath the earth, not mentioning that the princess was her own mother, whom Pauline would never see again. She'd tell him about a brave knight who traveled far away to a magical city by the sea, encoding the information that his father, a man named Joseph, who had been sold to Mobile 3 years earlier, might still be alive somewhere. These stories were Pauline's way of giving Marcus something Josephine couldn't take away, a sense of connection to people who loved him, a hidden history that contradicted the narrative of property and ownership that surrounded him. Other women did the same with their children during those brief, supervised visits. They embedded truth in fiction. They created memory in the spaces between words. They ensured that even if the children couldn't understand it at the time, some part of them would carry forward the knowledge that they came from people who had loved them despite impossible circumstances. In 1852, Josephine began a new phase of her program. She started documenting third-generation births. Children whose mothers had themselves been born in the breeding program were now old enough to be incorporated into the system. This represented the full realization of Josephine's vision, a completely self-sustaining population where every individual had been literally bred for specific characteristics, where genetic lineage could be traced through carefully maintained records, where human beings were cultivated like prize roses, selected and crossed to produce desired traits. Charlotte's daughter, Desiree, turned 15 in 1852. She had been born in the underground complex. She had never known any life except Riverside Plantation. She had grown up watching her mother and the other women go through pregnancy after pregnancy. She understood exactly what awaited her. The day Desiree was brought to the examination room for her first medical assessment, Charlotte had to watch. Josephine required it. She wanted the older women to witness the next generation's incorporation into the system, to understand that the cycle was permanent and inevitable. Charlotte stood in that room and watched Dr. Devereaux, now 70 years old, but still conducting examinations with the same clinical detachment, assess her daughter the way he had once assessed her. She watched Josephine make notes in her breeding journals, calculating which man should be paired with Desiree to produce optimal offspring. And something broke in Charlotte that had survived 22 years of systematic exploitation. She had endured her own violations. She had given birth to 6 children and watched 5 of them sold away. She had learned every survival technique the women had developed, but watching her daughter enter the same hell she had endured for more than 2 decades shattered whatever psychological armor she'd built. That night, Charlotte tried to hang herself in her cell using strips of fabric torn from her dress. Rachel found her before she died, cut her down, revived her. The other women gathered around Charlotte as she sobbed, not with the careful control they'd all learned to maintain, but with complete abandonment. "I can't watch her go through this," Charlotte said. "I can't watch Desiree become what I became. I thought if I survived, if I cooperated, my children might somehow escape this. But they're never going to escape. This is going to continue forever. We're breeding our own children into slavery within slavery." The women had no comfort to offer because Charlotte was right. The system was designed to be permanent. Josephine had created something that could reproduce itself infinitely. As long as slavery remained legal, as long as Riverside Plantation existed, women would be locked in these rooms and forced to produce children who would grow up to produce more children, generation after generation. Rachel sat with Charlotte through that night. She didn't try to convince her to hope. She didn't offer false reassurance. Instead, she reminded Charlotte of something fundamental. "We document," Rachel said. "We remember. We make sure that what's happening here doesn't disappear into Josephine's sanitized records. Maybe we'll never see justice. Maybe Desiree and her children and her children's children will all suffer the same way we have. But someday, someone needs to know the truth, and we're the only ones who can preserve it." This became the women's purpose. Not survival for its own sake, but survival as an act of historical witness. They maintained the true accounting with even greater dedication. They taught the younger women, including Desiree, to memorize names and dates and details. They created a collective memory that paralleled and contradicted Josephine's official documentation. They couldn't change their present circumstances, but they could ensure the future would know what had happened in these underground rooms. In 1854, Dr. Devereux died. He was 72 years old. His death represented a significant challenge for Josephine. Finding another physician willing to conduct examinations and attend births for enslaved women in a breeding program wasn't simple. Many doctors, while comfortable with slavery in general, were uncomfortable with the explicitly sexual nature of the work. Josephine eventually hired Dr. Etienne Lafont, a younger physician who had studied in Paris and returned to Louisiana with significant debts and few patients. He needed money more than he needed moral consistency. The examinations continued. The pregnancies continued. The system adapted to new management but didn't fundamentally change. Dr. Lafont was, if anything, more ruthless than his predecessor. Dr. Devereux had at least maintained a clinical detachment. Dr. Lafont seemed to take satisfaction in his power over the women. His examinations were more invasive than necessary, his commentary more degrading. He represented a new generation of medical professionals who had been trained in an era where scientific racism was becoming academically respectable. He brought with him theories about racial characteristics and heredity that were gaining currency in medical schools. He measured the women's skulls. He documented their physical features according to elaborate classification systems. He treated them not just as breeding stock, but as subjects for scientific inquiry into what he believed were fundamental racial differences. The women hated Dr. Lafont in ways they had never quite hated Dr. Devereux. The older doctor had at least treated them with the indifferent professionalism he might have shown to livestock. Lafont treated them with active contempt, as if their suffering confirmed his theories about racial inferiority. But even this cruelty became something the women added to their documentation. They memorized Lafont's exact words. They noted his procedures. They preserved evidence of a system that was becoming, if anything, more brutally efficient in the 1,850 seconds, as scientific racism provided new justifications for old exploitation. By 1857, the underground complex housed 38 women, ranging in age from 15 to 40. 14 of them, including Desiree, were second generation, born in the breeding program itself. The nursery held 23 children under age 6. Throughout Riverside's operations worked another 42 individuals who had been born in the basement and raised to serve the plantation's needs. Josephine was now 63 years old. She had spent nearly 30 years perfecting her system. She had accumulated wealth that made her one of the richest women in Louisiana. And she had done it all while maintaining a reputation as a genteel, educated, pious plantation owner who attended Mass regularly and made generous donations to the church. The cognitive dissonance was breathtaking. Josephine could spend her mornings reviewing breeding records that documented systematic sexual exploitation, then spend her afternoons hosting tea parties where she discussed literature and music with neighboring plantation mistresses. She could calculate the financial return on forced pregnancies, then kneel in prayer at Sunday Mass. This capacity for compartmentalization wasn't unique to Josephine. It characterized the entire slaveholding class. They built elaborate justifications that allowed them to commit atrocities while maintaining self-images as civilized, Christian, honorable people. But by the late 1852s, that system of justifications was beginning to crack. The national political crisis over slavery was intensifying. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859 sent shockwaves through the South. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 triggered secession crisis. Louisiana left the Union in January 1861. The Civil War's outbreak in April 1861 initially seemed distant from Riverside Plantation, but slowly the war began to disrupt even the carefully controlled environment of the underground complex. Young white men from the parish enlisted in Confederate regiments. Riverside's overseer left to join the army. Josephine struggled to find reliable supervisors to manage the plantation's operations. The price of luxury goods from Europe and the North skyrocketed. Even the medical supplies Dr. Lafont required became scarce. More significantly, enslaved people throughout the South were hearing about Union armies, about contraband camps where fugitives found protection, about the possibility, however distant, that the war might end slavery entirely. Hope, that dangerous thing, began to circulate through the underground community with new intensity. The women whispered to each other about what they'd heard from field workers, about Union gunboats on the Mississippi, about plantations closer to New Orleans where enslaved people had fled to Union lines. Rachel, now in her 40s and beyond childbearing age, but retained for her sewing skills and supervisory role, tried to temper this hope with realism. Even if the North wins, even if slavery ends, we need to be careful. Freedom won't mean justice. We might get out of these rooms, but we'll still be black women in Louisiana. We'll still be vulnerable. We need to plan for what comes after, not just dream about it. This pragmatic approach to potential liberation revealed the psychological scars the women carried. They had learned not to trust promises. They had survived by expecting the worst. Even the possibility of freedom carried risks they needed to prepare for. In 1862, New Orleans fell to Union forces. Federal troops occupied the city. Suddenly, Union authority extended up the Mississippi River, getting closer to Ascension Parish. Josephine, like other plantation owners in the region, faced a difficult calculation. Should she remain at Riverside, trying to maintain control? Or should she evacuate inland, taking her most valuable property with her? She chose to stay. Riverside was too valuable to abandon, and she believed that even if Union forces occupied the parish, they wouldn't interfere with property rights. Slavery might be contested on the national level, but surely individual property ownership would be respected. This calculation revealed how completely Josephine had internalized the idea that enslaved people were property first and people second. Even with Union armies approaching, she worried more about losing her financial investment than about the moral reckoning that might come. The women in the underground complex heard about New Orleans's fall. They heard about Union troops. And they began to discuss something they'd never seriously considered before, the possibility of survival beyond Riverside Plantation. They had spent years, some of them decades, in those underground rooms. They had borne children in that basement. They had been examined and violated and forced to participate in a system designed to strip away their humanity. But they had never truly believed they would live to see an end to it. Now, for the first time, they began to imagine freedom, not as a distant abstraction or a spiritual promise, but as a concrete possibility that might arrive with Union soldiers. Pauline, who had been at Riverside since 1839, began teaching literacy to the younger women. Officially, she was instructing them in needlework, but hidden in the sewing patterns she demonstrated were letters and numbers. She taught them to read and write in stolen moments, preparing them for a freedom that might require documentation and navigation of bureaucratic systems. This was the women's way. Even imprisoned, even exploited, they prepared for survival beyond their current circumstances. They refused to be defined entirely by their victimization. They maintained skills and knowledge and relationships that might become resources if the world ever changed enough to matter. In August 1862, Union troops arrived in Ascension Parish. They established a military garrison in Donaldsonville. Federal authority now extended to the region around Riverside Plantation. But the women's liberation didn't come immediately. The Union Army's policy towards slavery in occupied Louisiana was contradictory and evolving. Some officers returned fugitive slaves to plantations, treating slavery as a property issue that military occupation didn't resolve. Others established contraband camps where escaped slaves found protection. Still others simply ignored the whole question, focusing on military objectives. Josephine, showing remarkable adaptability, presented herself to Union officers as a loyal woman who had always opposed secession. She emphasized her French heritage, noting that France had abolished slavery, and she personally found the institution distasteful. She conveniently failed to mention the underground breeding program she'd operated for over 30 years. The Union officers who visited Riverside saw a well-maintained plantation with healthy-looking enslaved people. They had no reason to investigate the underground complex. The mansion's architecture didn't suggest hidden chambers, and Josephine had always been careful to keep the breeding program secret from outsiders who might find it distasteful. So the women remained trapped. Union forces occupied the parish. Federal authority theoretically extended to Riverside. But nothing changed in the underground rooms. The examinations continued. The pregnancies continued. Dr. Lafont still visited twice weekly. Josephine still maintained her breeding records. The proximity of potential freedom made captivity even more unbearable. The women could hear Union troops passing on the river road. They could imagine walking out of those underground rooms into a world where they might be recognized as human beings rather than property. But they remained locked in the darkness. This is when Charlotte made her decision. She was 44 years old. She had been in the breeding program since 1830, 32 years. She had given birth to 9 children, 7 of whom had been sold. Her daughter Desiree was now part of the same system. Her granddaughter, Desiree's child, had just been born in the same basement where Charlotte had spent most of her adult life. 3 generations of her bloodline had been produced in those underground rooms, and Charlotte decided she was done cooperating. During Dr. Lafont's next examination, Charlotte refused to comply. When he ordered her onto the examination table, she said no. When he threatened punishment, she said she didn't care. When he physically tried to force her, she fought back with a strength born of 3 decades of suppressed rage. Dr. Lafont called for help. The house servants who supervised the complex restrained Charlotte, but she kept screaming, not in fear or pain, but in defiant rage. I am not your animal. I am not your property. I am a human being, and I will not cooperate anymore. Do whatever you want to me, but I'm done pretending this is anything other than rape. I'm done acting like this system is normal. Her screams echoed through the underground chambers. Every woman heard her, and something fundamental shifted in that moment. For 32 years, Survival had required cooperation, silence, the appearance of consent to a system that allowed no actual choice. But Charlotte's screams broke that enforced silence. She said out loud what they'd all known but never been allowed to speak. Josephine was summoned. She came down to the examination room to find Charlotte restrained but still screaming. The other women had gathered in the corridor outside, drawn by the commotion. For the first time in the program's history, Josephine faced potential collective resistance. She made a quick calculation. Charlotte was past childbearing age, useful only for sewing work. She was now a liability, disrupting the careful control that kept the system functioning. And with Union troops in the parish, Josephine needed to maintain the appearance that Riverside's enslaved people were content. She ordered Charlotte removed from the breeding complex and placed in field work. It was meant as punishment, but it was actually liberation. Charlotte spent her first night in the quarters above ground, sleeping in a cabin with other field workers, seeing stars for the first time in over 3 decades. The women remaining in the underground complex understood Charlotte's rebellion as a message. Cooperation wasn't required forever. Resistance was possible, even at great cost. And the system that had seemed permanent might actually be vulnerable. They began planning more carefully. Not dramatic escape attempts, but systematic preparation for the chaos they sensed was coming. They memorized information about where children had been sold, details that might help reunite families after liberation. They taught each other skills that might be valuable in freedom. They prepared for survival beyond Riverside. By late 1864, Confederate authority in Louisiana had collapsed in most of the state. The Union Army controlled New Orleans and the Mississippi River. Ascension Parish was nominally under federal occupation, though isolated plantations like Riverside still operated with minimal direct supervision. In January 1865, as Sherman's army marched through the South and Confederate defeat became inevitable, Josephine made one final calculation. She began destroying records, the breeding journals, the medical documentation, the charts tracking 3 generations of genetic manipulation. She burned them in the mansion's fireplaces, page by page, eliminating evidence of what she'd created. But she couldn't destroy the women's memories. She couldn't burn away the true accounting they had maintained collectively, the names and dates and sales prices they had committed to memory, the stories they had preserved, the testimony they were ready to give. The end came suddenly. On the 9th of April 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox. By late April, news had reached even isolated plantations in Louisiana that the Confederacy no longer existed. Enslaved people throughout the South were hearing the word that would change everything: freedom. At Riverside Plantation, the news arrived on the 23rd of April 1865, carried by a Union officer and 2 soldiers who rode up the main drive. They had orders to register formerly enslaved people, ensure they understood their new legal status, and document plantation conditions for the Freedmen's Bureau. Josephine met them on the mansion's front gallery with perfect composure. She explained that her enslaved people had always been well treated, that she had no objection to their freedom, and that she would cooperate fully with federal authorities. She was charming, civilized. She offered the officers refreshment and answered their questions with careful precision. She did not mention the underground complex beneath her feet. She did not volunteer information about the breeding program she had operated for 35 years. And the Union officers, overwhelmed with registering thousands of formerly enslaved people across the parish, didn't investigate beyond what they could see on the surface. But Charlotte, who had been working in the field since her expulsion from the underground complex, approached the officers. She was skeletal thin, her body worn down by decades of forced pregnancies and recent months of hard field labor. But her voice was steady. "Sir, there's something you need to see, something Madame Blanchard won't tell you about." The officers followed Charlotte behind the main house to the concealed entrance, down the brick stairs, into the underground chambers where 34 women still lived, most of them pregnant or recovering from recent births. The officers' shock was documented in their official report, filed with the Freedmen's Bureau 3 days later. We discovered extensive underground facilities housing colored women in conditions suggesting systematic forced breeding operations. The women report being confined to these chambers for periods ranging from months to decades. Several women displayed evidence of multiple pregnancies. Medical equipment and examination facilities suggest organized program of reproduction management. Madame Blanchard claims the facilities were used only for medical care and protection, but testimony from the women contradicts this assertion. The women were brought out of the underground complex on the 24th of April 1865. Some of them hadn't seen sunlight in years. Rachel, who had been part of the program since 1832, was 47 years old. She had spent 33 years in those rooms, 1/3 of a century underground. When she emerged into daylight, the sun was so bright it hurt her eyes. She stood on grass for the first time in decades, feeling soil beneath her feet instead of limestone floors. And she wept. Not with joy, exactly. The trauma of what she'd endured couldn't be erased by liberation, but with relief, with the overwhelming sensation of breathing air that wasn't filtered through underground ventilation shafts. Pauline emerged with her son Marcus, now 14 years old. She had been at Riverside since 1839, 26 years, 24 of them spent underground. She had given birth to 7 children, 4 had been sold, 3 remained at Riverside, including Marcus. The reunion between Pauline and her children wasn't the joyous embrace you might imagine. The children had been raised to see her as Pauline, not as mother. They had been taught that family bonds were irrelevant, that loyalty belonged to the plantation. Rebuilding those relationships after liberation would take years, and for some families, it would never fully happen. Desiree, Charlotte's daughter, emerged carrying her own infant daughter. 3 generations of one family, all born in the same underground complex, all products of Josephine's systematic breeding program. Charlotte held her granddaughter for the first time in daylight and tried to comprehend that this baby would not grow up in those rooms, would not be examined by doctors, would not be paired with men selected from breeding charts. The cycle that had seemed permanent and eternal had finally broken. But liberation didn't mean justice. The Union officers documented what they'd found at Riverside, but no charges were filed against Josephine. What she had done was horrifying, but it hadn't been illegal under Louisiana law during slavery. The breeding program, the underground chambers, the systematic exploitation, all of it had been within a slaveholder's legal rights to manage their property. Josephine faced no punishment. She lost her enslaved workforce, which represented a significant financial loss, but she retained ownership of Riverside Plantation. She continued living in the mansion. She attended Mass at the same church. She maintained her position in parish society. The women who had survived her breeding program received their freedom and nothing else. No compensation for decades of exploitation, no assistance finding children who had been sold, no medical care for bodies that had been damaged by forced pregnancies, no psychological support for trauma that would pursue them for the rest of their lives. This is what freedom meant in 1865 Louisiana, not justice, not restitution, just the technical legal status of no longer being property. The Freedmen's Bureau established a camp near Donaldsonville, where formerly enslaved people could receive temporary shelter and assistance. Many of Riverside's freed people went there, including most of the women from the breeding program. They needed help finding housing, locating family members, navigating a legal system that now technically recognized them as human beings but provided little practical support. Rachel spent her first weeks of freedom giving testimony to Freedmen's Bureau agents. She told them everything: the 33 years underground, the forced pregnancies, the children sold, the systematic nature of Josephine's breeding program, the medical examinations, the documentation she and the other women had memorized. But the Bureau agents, overwhelmed with managing transition from slavery to freedom across the entire South, treated her testimony as just another account of slavery's general brutality. They documented that families had been separated, that women had been forced to bear children, that conditions had been harsh. But they didn't capture the systematic, multi-generational, scientifically managed nature of what had occurred at Riverside. Rachel persisted. She began writing down the true accounting that she and the other women had preserved in memory. She filled notebook after notebook with names, dates, sales records, physical descriptions. She documented everything Josephine had tried to destroy by burning her breeding journals. This written record, discovered decades later in a trunk in Rachel's granddaughter's attic, would become crucial evidence for historians trying to understand the full scope of breeding programs in Antebellum, Louisiana. Charlotte spent her freedom years searching for her children. She placed advertisements in newspapers. She wrote letters to freedmen's bureau offices across the South. She traveled when she could afford it, following leads that might reunite her with the 7 children who had been sold away from Riverside. She found 3 of them. Her oldest son, Thomas, was living in New Orleans, working as a carpenter. Her daughter, Sarah, had been sold to a plantation in Mississippi and had died there in 1859 at age 19 during childbirth. Another son, James, had escaped to Union lines during the war and enlisted in the United States Colored Troops. He had survived the war and was farming in Arkansas. The other 4 children Charlotte never located. They existed in Josephine's burned breeding records, their births and characteristics noted, their sale prices documented. But their ultimate fates disappeared into the chaos of slavery and war. Charlotte searched until her death in 1883, never giving up hope that she might find them. This became the pattern for most of the women freed from Riverside's underground complex. They spent their remaining years searching for lost children, trying to rebuild families that systematic breeding programs had torn apart. Some succeeded in finding 1 or 2 children. Most never found them all. A few never found any. Pauline remained in Ascension Parish, working as a seamstress. She maintained contact with her 3 children who had remained at Riverside. Marcus became a skilled carpenter. Her daughters, Celine and Marie, both married and raised families. But the relationship between Pauline and her children was always complicated by the circumstances of their conception and the forced separations of their early years. Pauline struggled with what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. She had nightmares about the examination room. She couldn't tolerate enclosed spaces. She experienced panic attacks triggered by medical settings. She lived with depression that sometimes made it difficult to function. And she had no access to mental health support that might have helped her process decades of systematic trauma. This was the lasting impact of breeding programs that historical accounts often fail to capture. The physical liberation in 1865 didn't heal psychological wounds that would never fully close. The women who survived carried trauma that manifested in nightmares, in difficulty forming romantic relationships after years of systematized sexual exploitation, in complicated relationships with children born under forced circumstances, in mistrust of medical professionals, in hypervigilance and anxiety that pursued them until death. And they passed that trauma to their children and grandchildren. The descendants of women who survived breeding programs carried forward the knowledge of how their families were created. They grew up with mothers or grandmothers who sometimes woke screaming from nightmares about underground rooms. They inherited the psychological legacy of systematic dehumanization that didn't end with legal freedom. In 1873, Rachel died at age 55. Her death certificate listed the cause as consumption, the 19th century term for tuberculosis. But her granddaughter, who cared for her during her final illness, later testified that Rachel had simply worn out. Decades of forced pregnancies, inadequate nutrition, and psychological trauma had destroyed her body's ability to recover. At Rachel's funeral, 7 women who had survived Riverside's breeding program gathered to mourn. They told stories about Rachel's strength, her intelligence, her role in maintaining the true accounting that preserved truth Josephine had tried to erase. They remembered her as someone who had refused to let the system completely destroy her humanity. And they made a pact. They would continue documenting. They would tell their stories to their children and grandchildren. They would ensure that what happened in those underground rooms would not be forgotten or sanitized by history. This pact became the foundation for testimony that would eventually emerge decades later. Meanwhile, Josephine continued living at Riverside. She adapted to post-war Louisiana with the same practical efficiency she'd applied to managing her breeding program. She hired formerly enslaved people as paid laborers, paying wages so low they were barely better than enslavement. She maintained her social position. She donated to charity. She presented herself as a woman who had always been kind to her servants and who bore no ill will toward those who had once been her property. She lived comfortably until 1889, when she died at age 85. Her obituary in the Donaldsonville newspaper described her as a woman of remarkable intelligence and business acumen who managed one of the parish's most successful plantations for 6 decades. It made no mention of the underground breeding complex, no mention of the women she had systematically exploited, no mention of the children she had sold. Josephine died wealthy, respected, and unpunished. She never expressed remorse for what she'd done, never acknowledged that her business acumen had been built on the destruction of human lives, never faced any earthly justice for 35 years of systematic sexual exploitation. 2 years after her death came the fire. On a hot July night in 1891, lightning struck Riverside's mansion. The building, dried by summer heat, burned with terrifying intensity. By the time firefighters arrived from Donaldsonville, the structure was engulfed. They focused on preventing the fire from spreading to neighboring properties. That's when the third-floor collapse revealed the staircase. When firefighters descended into the underground complex, when they found the examination tables, the leather restraints, the handwriting on the walls documenting decades of systematic breeding, the fire marshal's report described what they'd found, but in sanitized language that suggested medical facilities of unclear purpose. Local newspapers ran brief stories about unusual underground chambers discovered at the former Blanchard estate, but the full truth wasn't published. The white establishment in Ascension Parish had no interest in exposing what one of their most prominent families had done. But the black community knew. The elderly women who had survived Riverside's breeding program recognized the descriptions in the newspaper accounts. They knew exactly what those rooms had been, and they began talking more openly about what they'd endured. In 1897, a historian from Boston named Walter Garrison came to Louisiana to document the experiences of formerly enslaved people. He was part of a new generation of scholars who wanted to capture first-hand testimony before all the survivors died. He placed advertisements in churches and met with community leaders, seeking people willing to tell their stories. 6 women who had survived Riverside's breeding program agreed to give recorded testimony. It was the first time their experiences were captured in their own words, rather than filtered through the clinical documentation of their enslavers or the brief summaries of Freedmen's Bureau agents. Pauline was one of those women. She was 76 years old, living in a small house in Donaldsonville. Her testimony, preserved in the archives of the Boston Historical Society, provides devastating detail about the breeding program's operation. "People ask me why we didn't resist more," Pauline told Garrison. "They don't understand the choices we faced. It wasn't between freedom and captivity. It was between one kind of hell and another. Madame Blanchard made sure we knew that resistance meant being sold to plantations where field workers died within a few years, where you'd never see your children, where conditions were even worse than the underground rooms. So we cooperated. We endured the examinations. We bore the children they forced on us. We participated in a system designed to break us. And we found ways to survive that I'm not sure anyone who hasn't experienced it can truly understand. But here's what I want people to know. We were more than what was done to us. Even in those rooms, even during the worst of it, we found ways to love each other, to support each other, to maintain some sense of dignity and humanity. We sang, we told stories, We created community in the spaces between the forced pregnancies and examinations. And we documented everything. We knew Madame Blanchard was keeping records, so we kept our own. We memorized names and dates and sales prices. We preserved truth she wanted to hide. And after freedom came, we wrote it all down. So that someday people would know what really happened. Not the sanitized version, not the clinical documentation, but the human truth of what we endured and how we survived. Pauline's testimony, along with the accounts from the other 5 women, provided the most comprehensive documentation of a plantation breeding program ever recorded. The testimonies described the medical procedures, the forced pairings, the systematic separation of mothers and children, and the multi-generational nature of the exploitation. But they also documented resistance, the small rebellions, the collective memory the women maintained, the ways they preserved their humanity despite systematic attempts to reduce them to reproductive machinery. The strength it took not just to survive, but to survive with enough psychological integrity to eventually tell their stories. Garrison's work was published in 1901 as Voices from Bondage, Testimony of Louisiana's Enslaved People. It received little attention at the time. The early 20th century was the nadir of race relations in America. White supremacy was reasserting itself through Jim Crow laws and racial violence. Stories about slavery's systematic sexual exploitation didn't fit the lost cause mythology that was becoming dominant in the South. But the testimonies existed, preserved in archives, waiting for a time when Americans would be willing to confront the full truth of what slavery had entailed. That time came slowly. It wasn't until the 1960 seconds during the Civil Rights Movement that historians began seriously investigating breeding programs on antebellum plantations. Researchers discovered that what happened at Riverside wasn't unique. At least 40 plantations in Louisiana alone had operated similar programs. The practice extended to Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, and other southern states. Conservative estimates suggest that between 1,820 and 1,865, at least 100,000 enslaved women were subjected to systematic breeding programs across the South. Hundreds of thousands of children were born under these circumstances. Millions of Americans today are descendants of people who survived these programs. The underground complex at Riverside was filled in during the 1,890 seconds when the property was sold. The new owners had no interest in preserving evidence of Josephine's breeding program. They leveled the mansion's ruins and converted the land to agricultural use. Today, the site shows no evidence of what occurred beneath its surface. But the evidence exists in other forms, in the written testimony of survivors, in the records Rachel and other women preserved, in genealogical research that traces families torn apart by systematic breeding, in the stories passed down through generations of descendants who still carry the legacy of what their ancestors endured. Charlotte's great-great-granddaughter, a woman named Evelyn Morris, spent 20 years researching her family history. She traced her lineage back to Charlotte, documented the 7 children Charlotte bore in Riverside's underground complex, and tracked what became of them. 3 she located definitively. 2 she found probable matches for. 2 remained lost to history. In 2003, Evelyn published a family history that included Charlotte's story. She described her ancestors' 32 years in the breeding program, the children sold away, the decades spent searching for lost family after liberation. She documented the intergenerational trauma that affected Charlotte's descendants, including depression, anxiety, and difficulties forming healthy relationships that persisted across multiple generations. Understanding where we come from doesn't erase the trauma, Evelyn wrote, but it helps us make sense of patterns in our family that otherwise seemed inexplicable. The strength it took for Charlotte to survive what she endured, the resilience she passed down to her children and grandchildren, the determination to document truth and preserve memory, that's what I inherited, along with the trauma. This kind of genealogical research has become more common as descendants of enslaved people use DNA testing and archival records to trace their families' histories. Many discover that their ancestors were born in plantation breeding programs, that their family trees include forced pairings documented in slaveholders' records, that the circumstances of their existence were shaped by systematic sexual exploitation, that their ancestors somehow survived. The last person born in Riverside's underground complex died in 1971. Her name was Sarah Mouton. She was born in 1863, just 2 years before liberation. She spent her first 2 years underground, then was freed along with her mother when Union troops arrived. Sarah spent her entire life searching for family members who had been sold before the war. She placed advertisements, she followed leads. She attended reunions where formerly enslaved people and their descendants gathered, hoping to reconnect with lost relatives. She never found her father, who had been sold to Mississippi in 1862. She never found 2 older half-siblings her mother had borne in the breeding program. In 1969, at age 106, Sarah gave one final interview to a graduate student researching Louisiana slavery. She was nearly blind by then, her memory fragmented, but she remembered her mother's stories about the underground rooms, about the examinations, about the forced pregnancies, about the community of women who supported each other through impossible circumstances. "My mama told me," Sarah said in that interview, "that even in that basement, even when everything was designed to break them, the women found ways to be human, to be kind to each other, to love their children even when they knew those children would be taken away." She said that was their resistance, that they refused to become the animals Madame Blanchard treated them as. And she told me to remember, to tell my children, to make sure the truth didn't die with her generation, because the people who did these things, they wanted it forgotten. They wanted to destroy the evidence and let it all disappear into history. But we don't forget. We can't forget, not just because of what was done to our ancestors, but because of how they survived it. That strength, that refusal to be completely destroyed, that's what they passed down to us. Sarah died in 1971 at age 108. With her death, the last living connection to Riverside's breeding program disappeared. But the story persists, in testimony preserved in archives, in genealogical research, in family histories passed down through generations, in the collective memory of a community that refuses to let these crimes be forgotten. The broader historical significance of breeding programs like Riverside's challenges common narratives about slavery. We're taught about slavery as a labor system, about cotton and tobacco and sugar, about economic relationships between North and South, about political debates over slavery's expansion. What we're taught less often is that slavery was also a systematic program of sexual exploitation and reproductive control. That enslaved women's bodies were sites of violence that went beyond forced labor. That children were produced deliberately through calculated breeding programs that treated human reproduction as industrial manufacturing. This wasn't just the behavior of individual sadistic slaveholders, it was a widespread business model that plantation owners discussed openly and shared with each other. They corresponded about breeding techniques. They traded enslaved men to diversify their genetic stock. They documented their programs with the same attention other businesses might give to inventory management. And it was legal. Everything Josephine did at Riverside violated basic human dignity and modern standards of human rights, but it violated no laws. Enslaved people had no legal right to bodily autonomy, no protection from sexual exploitation, no claim to their own children. The law treated them as property, and property rights trumped any consideration of their humanity. Understanding this forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how systematic dehumanization functions. It wasn't just violence and brutality, though there was plenty of that. It was also the bureaucratic organization of exploitation, the careful documentation, the application of scientific principles to human breeding, the economic calculations that treated births and deaths as profit and loss. The women who survived programs like Riverside's demonstrated forms of resistance that history sometimes fails to recognize. They didn't lead dramatic slave rebellions. They didn't escape to freedom. Most couldn't, given the circumstances of their captivity and the threats to their children. Instead, they resisted by maintaining their humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. They created community among themselves. They loved their children despite knowing those children would be taken. They documented what was happening when their captors tried to hide it. They preserved memory when powerful people wanted to destroy evidence. And when liberation came, they spent the rest of their lives searching for lost children, rebuilding families, telling their stories to anyone who would listen. They ensured that what happened in those underground rooms would not disappear into sanitized historical narratives. Their descendants continue that work today, researching genealogies, preserving testimonies, ensuring that breeding programs are understood not as footnotes to slavery's history, but as central to understanding how slavery functioned as a system of sexual exploitation and reproductive control. What happened at Riverside Plantation and at dozens of similar facilities across the antebellum South represents one of the darkest chapters in American history. Not because it was uniquely evil, but because it reveals the logical endpoint of treating human beings as property. Once you accept that premise, everything else follows. The breeding programs, the systematic sexual exploitation, the destruction of families, the reduction of reproduction to profit calculation. The women who survived these programs deserved more than they received. They deserved justice, which never came. They deserved compensation, which they never got. They deserved support in healing from trauma, which didn't exist. They deserved to find their children, which most never did. What they got was freedom in the technical legal sense and the burden of surviving with trauma that would pursue them until death. They got to rebuild lives from nothing, in a society that still denied their full humanity even after slavery ended. They got to pass their stories down to descendants who still grapple with the legacy of systematic exploitation. But they also got to survive, to refuse to be completely destroyed, to maintain enough strength and dignity to eventually tell their stories, to preserve truth that powerful people wanted hidden, to pass down resilience along with trauma. That survival, that insistence on being recognized as fully human despite systematic attempts to deny it, matters as much as the horror they endured. The history of places like Riverside isn't just about victimization. It's also about resistance, community, and the strength it takes not just to survive impossible circumstances, but to survive with enough integrity to bear witness. The sealed room beneath Josephine Blanchard's mansion is gone now, filled in and forgotten by the land above it. But the stories survive, the testimony persists, the descendants remember, and the truth, preserved by women who refuse to let it die, remains available to anyone willing to confront it. This is what we owe to Charlotte and Rachel and Pauline and Marie and Sarah and the thousands of other women whose names we don't know. To remember not just what was done to them, but how they survived it. To acknowledge not just their suffering but their strength, to preserve their testimony not as distant history but as truth that still resonates. Because what happened in those underground rooms wasn't ancient history. The last survivor died within the lifetime of people still living today. The descendants walk among us, carrying forward the legacy of strength and trauma their ancestors passed down. The evidence exists in archives and family stories and genealogical records. The question isn't whether this history exists, it's whether we're willing to face it honestly, to acknowledge the systematic sexual exploitation at slavery's core, to recognize the multi-generational trauma that continues affecting descendants today, to understand that freedom in 1865 didn't erase what had been done or heal what had been broken, and to honor the women who survived by telling their stories completely, not the sanitized version, not the comfortable narrative that skips over the worst details, but the full truth of what they endured and how they maintained their humanity despite systematic attempts to destroy it. That's what the sealed room exists for, to preserve stories that history tried to bury, to give voice to people who were silenced, to ensure that truth survives even when powerful forces try to destroy it. The women who survived Riverside's breeding program couldn't tell their stories publicly during their lifetimes. The society they lived in wasn't ready to hear testimony about systematic sexual exploitation and forced breeding. But they preserved their stories anyway, knowing that someday someone would be ready to listen. That day is now. We have the testimony, we have the evidence, we have the descendants willing to share their families' histories. The question is whether we'll honor those women by actually confronting the truth they preserved at such great cost. Because the sealed room exists. It exists in archives and testimonies and family memories. It exists in the genealogical research of descendants tracing bloodlines created by forced breeding. It exists in the collective memory of a community that refuses to forget. And it exists in the stories we tell about American history, about what slavery actually meant, about the systematic exploitation that was central to the system, not peripheral to it, about the women who survived and the strategies they used to maintain humanity in the face of dehumanization. Their stories demand remembering, not to create despair but to recognize resilience, not to dwell on victimization but to honor survival, not to forget the horror but to ensure the truth persists. The women who survived Riverside's underground breeding complex left us a gift. They documented what happened. They preserved truth despite attempts to destroy it. They survived with enough strength to eventually tell their stories. They passed down resilience along with trauma. The least we can do is listen, to really hear what they're telling us across the decades, to acknowledge the full truth of what they endured, to recognize the strength it took to survive, and to ensure their testimony becomes part of how we understand our history. What do you think about this hidden chapter of American history? How should we honor the women who survived systematic breeding programs? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, or challenged what you thought you knew about slavery's realities, please like this video and share it with others. Subscribe to The Sealed Room because stories like this deserve to be told, preserved and remembered. These voices refuse to be silenced. Let's make sure they're finally heard.